50-year-old wealthy white man found his soulmate in a poor town, a young black woman. The morning sun streamed through the huge windows of the office at the top of the skyscraper, bathing the meeting room in a golden light that contrasted with the coldness of the room. James Morrison, aged 50, sat at the head of the long glass table, his face marked by expression lines that told stories of countless negotiations and sleepless nights. His blue eyes, once full of enthusiasm, now seemed dull, reflecting the boredom that had settled into his soul. "Gentlemen, the figures for the last quarter are impressive," said Robert, the CFO, with a satisfied smile. "Our profit increased by 15%, and the projections for next year are even more promising." James nodded mechanically, his fingers drumming on the cold surface of the table. The voices around him blended into a monotonous hum. Words like acquisition, expansion, and market floating in the air like empty balloons. "James, any comments?" The voice of Sarah, his assistant, brought him back to reality. He sniffed, adjusting his silk tie. "Excellent work, team. Keep it up." The words came out automatic, rehearsed. An artificial smile formed on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. As the meeting continued, James found himself observing the faces around him. Men and women in impeccable suits, all so alike in their relentless pursuit of more money, more power, more status. It was like looking into a distorted mirror of himself, and the image made him nauseous. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the meeting came to an end. James stood up, shaking hands and exchanging empty smiles. "Great presentation, Robert. Excellent ideas, Jennifer." Ready-made phrases that he repeated without thinking. Alone in his office, James loosened his tie and dropped into the leather chair. His eyes wandered around the room, past the awards, certificates and photos of handshakes with celebrities and politicians, symbols of success that now seemed so insignificant. His gaze lingered on a small picture frame on the bookshelf. He stood up and picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. In the picture, a boy of about 10 was smiling openly, his hair disheveled and his face dirty with dirt. In the background, a simple house and a large oak tree. James ran his fingers over the image, a wave of nostalgia sweeping over him. "What do you know, Jimmy?" he muttered to himself, using the nickname he hadn't heard in years. "Look how far you've come." But the question that echoed in his mind was another. At what cost? James put the photo back on the shelf and walked over to the window. Below, New York pulsed, a symphony of horns, sirens, and the constant buzz of millions of lives in motion. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, feeling more alone than ever in that city that never sleeps. His cell phone vibrated, bringing him back to reality. A message from Sarah. "Don't forget dinner with the investors tonight. Le Bernardin Restaurant, 8 p.m. James sighed deeply. Another dinner. More fake smiles, more empty conversations about money and power. The thought suffocated him. On an impulse, he picked up the phone and called Sarah. "Cancel my appointments for the next 2 weeks," he said as soon as she picked up. "But Mr. Morrison, tonight's dinner—" "Cancel everything, Sarah," he interrupted her, his voice firm. "Tell them I've had a family emergency. I'm taking some time off." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "I understand, sir. Shall I get the private jet ready?" James hesitated for a moment. "No, that won't be necessary. I'll drive." "Drive?" The surprise was evident in Sarah's voice. "Where to, if I may ask?" James looked again at the photo on the shelf, a small smile forming on his lips. "Home, Sarah. I'm coming home." He hung up the phone and began to pack a small suitcase. Simple, comfortable clothes, so different from the expensive suits she wore every day. At the bottom of a drawer, he found an old, faded cap with the Yankees logo. He put it on his head and looked at himself in the mirror. For a moment, he saw the reflection of the boy in the photo, full of dreams and hopes. "It's time to meet you again, Jimmy," he muttered to himself. He left the office without looking back, ignoring the surprised looks from his employees. In the elevator, he took off his tie and threw it in the trash. A symbolic gesture, but one that made him feel lighter. In the underground parking garage, he walked straight past his collection of luxury cars. He stopped in front of an old 1967 Chevrolet Impala covered in a tarpaulin. He hadn't driven it for years, but he had always kept it in perfect condition. As he removed the tarpaulin, a cloud of memories enveloped him. The smell of the leather, the shine of the dashboard, everything transported him to a simpler, truer time. James started the engine, feeling the familiar rumble vibrate through his body. With a genuine smile, his first in a long time, he pulled out of the garage and plunged into New York traffic. As the skyscrapers fell behind him, James felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. The road opened up in front of him, inviting, full of promise. He didn't know exactly what he would find in his hometown. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps redemption. But for the first time in years, he felt alive, looking forward to the unknown. The sun was beginning to set as James crossed the George Washington Bridge, leaving the city behind. The lights of Manhattan shone in the distance, like earthly stars. James looked through the rearview mirror, watching the city he had called home for so long drift away. "Goodbye for now," he muttered, a mixture of relief and apprehension in his voice. The road stretched out in front of him, an invitation to start again. James turned up the radio, an old country song filling the car. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to sing along out of tune and free. The Impala roared down the highway, taking James towards his past and, perhaps, a new future. Night was falling, but for James, it was as if the day had just begun. The afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, casting a soft light over the central square of Millbrook, the small town in the south of the United States that Emma called home. The normally quiet place was buzzing with activity that Saturday afternoon. Colorful tents dotted the manicured lawn, and the air was infused with the scent of cotton candy and freshly made popcorn. Emma Dawson, 25, was standing on a small makeshift stage, her green eyes shining with enthusiasm as she watched the gathering crowd. Her auburn hair was tied up in a messy bun, with unruly strands framing her freckled face. He wore faded jeans splattered with paint and a white t-shirt with the words "Art for All" printed in colorful letters. "Welcome, everyone," Emma exclaimed into the microphone, her voice full of contagious energy. "I'm so happy to see you all here today for our first community art festival." The crowd applauded, and Emma felt a wave of pride and gratitude. This event was the result of months of planning, sleepless nights, and countless cups of coffee. But every moment of stress and doubt was worth it to see the community gathered together, celebrating art and creativity. "As you know," Emma continued, "our Colors of Millbrook project has been working hard to bring more art and culture to our town. Today, you'll see the amazing talent we have right here in our community." As she spoke, Emma gestured animatedly, pointing to the various tents where local artists were exhibiting their work. There was everything: vibrant paintings, intriguing sculptures made from recycled materials, handmade jewelry, and even a glass blowing demonstration. "But this is just the beginning," Emma continued, her voice becoming more serious. "Our next big project is the revitalization of the old cinema on Main Street. We want to turn it into a community arts center, a place where everyone can learn, create, and express themselves." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd, but Emma also noticed a few skeptical expressions. She knew that not everyone in the city supported her ideas. Some saw art as an unnecessary luxury. Others feared that change would bring problems to quiet Millbrook. "I know some of you have doubts," Emma acknowledged, her voice softening, "but I believe with all my heart that art has the power to bring people together, to make us see the world in new ways, and most importantly, to give us hope and a sense of purpose." Just then, Emma saw a movement in the crowd. A group of older men, led by Frank Thompson, the owner of the local hardware store, were approaching the stage. Frank, a burly man with grey hair and a thick mustache, was known for his conservative stance and his vocal opposition to many of Emma's initiatives. "Excuse me, Miss Dawson," Frank interrupted, his deep voice echoing across the square, "but I think we need to talk about the costs of this project of yours." Emma felt her heart racing but kept her composure. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. What question do you have?" Frank crossed his arms, his gaze defiant. "You talk about transforming the cinema, but who's going to pay for it? The taxpayers? We have enough taxes without having to finance your artistic dreams." A tense silence fell over the crowd. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the stares on her. This was the moment she had been dreading but was prepared for. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your concern," Emma began, her voice calm but firm. "Funding will come from a combination of private donations, state grants for urban revitalization and fundraising events like this one. We're not asking for a tax increase." Before Frank could respond, an elderly voice rose from the crowd. "I support Emma." It was Mrs. Mabel Jenkins, an 80-year-old retired teacher. "Remember what Millbrook was like when we had the movie theater going? The town was alive. We need that back." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Emma felt a glimmer of hope. "Besides," Emma continued, gaining confidence, "an art center isn't just about paintings and sculptures. It's about education, about giving our children and young people a place to learn new skills, to express themselves in a positive way. It's about creating jobs and attracting tourists to our city." She paused, looking directly at Frank and his group. "Mr. Thompson, I know you care about Millbrook as much as I do. I'm not asking you to agree with me on everything, but I am asking you to give this idea a chance. Come, take part in our planning meetings. Your business experience would be very valuable." Frank seemed surprised by the invitation. His countenance softened a little, and he nodded slowly. "Well, maybe I'll show up at one of those meetings, just to keep you youngsters in line." A collective laugh eased the tension, and Emma felt a weight come off her shoulders. She smiled, grateful for the small victory. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, and thank you all," Emma said, turning to the crowd. "Now, let's enjoy this beautiful day and celebrate art in our community." With a final nod, Emma descended from the stage, immediately surrounded by a group of young artists eager to show their work. As she guided them around the tents, explaining techniques and sharing stories, Emma couldn't help but notice a man standing at a distance, watching the scene with interest. He looked out of place in his expensive suit, even though he had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. There was something familiar about his face, but Emma couldn't identify it. Their gazes met for a moment, and she felt a strange connection, as if she were in front of someone who would change her life. Before she could think any more about it, Emma was pulled back to reality by a young artist eager to show off his sculpture. With one last curious glance at the stranger, she plunged back into the festival, her heart full of hope for the future of Millbrook and the possibilities that lay ahead. The sun was already setting over the horizon when Emma finally got a moment to herself. The festival had been a success, but the hours of talking, explaining, and mediating small conflicts had left her exhausted. She moved away from the crowd, seeking some peace in the small garden behind the municipal library. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the last golden rays of the sun danced among the leaves of the trees. Emma sat down on a worn wooden bench, closing her eyes for a moment and letting the tension of the day drain from her shoulders. "Excuse me, is this place occupied?" The low, soft voice startled her. Emma opened her eyes to find the man she had noticed earlier, the stranger in the suit who seemed so out of place at the festival. Up close, she could see the frown lines on his face, the tired but curious blue eyes. "No, please," Emma gestured to the empty space next to her. "Sit down." The man settled down, keeping a respectful distance. For a moment they sat in silence, just watching the sunset. It was he who broke the silence. "That was quite an event you organized today," he commented, turning to her with a gentle smile. "I'm James, by the way, James Morrison." Emma felt a pang of recognition on hearing the name, but couldn't place it. "Emma Dawson," she introduced herself, holding out her hand. James's grip was firm, his calloused skin contrasting with his polished appearance. "You're not from around here, are you?" James laughed softly, a sound that sounded rusty, as if it wasn't used often. "Not anymore," he admitted. "I grew up here, but I left, well, a long time ago." There was a note of melancholy in his voice that intrigued Emma. "And what brings you back to Millbrook after so long, Mr. Morrison?" James seemed to ponder the question for a moment, his eyes roaming around the garden. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm looking for something I've lost." The vulnerability in his voice touched Emma. She recognized in him the same search for meaning that drove her in her community work. "Sometimes what we're looking for is right where we left it," she said softly. "We just need to look with fresh eyes." James stared at her, surprised by the depth of her words. "You're very wise for someone so young," he commented. Emma laughed, a light, musical sound. "Or maybe you're too cynical for someone so—" She stopped, blushing slightly. "Sorry, that was rude." No, James laughed, genuinely amused. "Please continue." "Someone so old-fashioned." "Out of fashion?" "I was going to say experienced," Emma replied with a mischievous smile. Their laughter mingled in the night air, creating a bubble of unexpected intimacy. When the silence returned, it was no longer uncomfortable, but charged with an energy that neither of them knew how to name. "So," James began, leaning a little towards her, "tell me about this arts center project. It sounds ambitious." Emma's eyes lit up, and she launched into an impassioned explanation of her plans, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. James watched her, fascinated not only by her ideas, but by the energy and conviction with which she presented them. "And with that, we hope to not only revitalize the building, but the whole community," Emma concluded a little breathlessly. Then, noticing James's intense gaze, she interrupted herself. "Sorry, I got carried away. You probably don't want to hear all those details." "On the contrary," James replied, his voice soft. "It's refreshing to see someone so passionate about something. It's been a long time since I've felt that kind of enthusiasm." There was a note of sadness in his voice that made Emma's heart squeeze. "It's never too late to rediscover a passion," she said gently, "or to find a new one." Their gazes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Emma felt her heart racing, aware of James' closeness, of the warmth emanating from him. James, for his part, was simultaneously attracted and intimidated by Emma's vitality and optimism. The moment was broken by the distant sound of music coming from the festival. Emma blinked, as if coming out of a trance. I should get back," she said, standing up abruptly. "I still have to help dismantle the tents." James stood up too, looking a little awkward. "Of course, I don't want to hold you up. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Emma." Emma hesitated for a moment, then, making an impulsive decision, said, "You know, we always need volunteers for the project. If you're interested in reconnecting with the community—" James smiled, a smile that lit up his whole face and made him look years younger. "I'd love to. When's the next meeting?" "Tuesday, 7 p.m. in the library," Emma replied, surprised at her own boldness, but happy with the positive response. "I'll be there," James promised. They said goodbye with a handshake that lasted a second longer than necessary. As Emma walked away, she couldn't help but look back. James was still there, watching her go, a solitary figure against the now starry sky. Back at the festival, Emma joined the volunteers cleaning up, but her mind was far away. She couldn't stop thinking about James, the unexpected connection they had felt, the mixture of strength and vulnerability she saw in him. James, for his part, stayed in the garden for a few more minutes, absorbing the conversation he had just had. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, he felt a spark of something he couldn't name. Hope, perhaps? Or the start of a new chapter in his life. As he walked back to his hotel, James found himself smiling to himself. The idea of taking part in the community project, something he would have dismissed out of hand just a few days ago, now seemed not only acceptable, but exciting. What had begun as a nostalgic trip to the past was turning into something more. And at the center of this transformation was Emma, a young woman who, in just one conversation, had managed to awaken feelings in James that he had thought were long lost. As night fell over Millbrook, both Emma and James fell asleep with thoughts of each other, anxious and apprehensive about what the future might bring. The art festival was over, but something new and unexpected was just beginning. Dawn in Millbrook painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, the light of the rising sun seeping through the curtains of Emma's small apartment. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the window. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions. Since that night in the library garden, Emma and James had been meeting regularly. He had shown up at the Arts Centre project meeting as promised, and had since become a constant presence at community events. Emma smiled as she remembered how out of place James had seemed at first, with his impeccable button-down shirts amid the jeans and t-shirts of the other volunteers. But he had quickly adapted, rolling up his sleeves and diving headfirst into the work, whether it was painting walls or helping to organize art workshops for children. Emma's smile, however, soon faded into a worried expression. Despite the joy she felt in James's company, a shadow of doubt hung over her. A gentle touch on her shoulder brought her out of her thoughts. Her grandmother, Grace, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and grey hair, put another cup of coffee on the table and sat down next to her granddaughter. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace asked gently, her southern accent making the words even warmer. Emma sighed, twirling the cup between her hands. "Grandma, do you think I'm making a mistake?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "With James, you mean?" Emma nodded, biting her lip. "It's just, he's so different. He comes from a completely different world to us. And he has all this history with the city, people who knew him before." "And that scares you?" Grace asked softly. "Yes," Emma admitted. "What if people think I'm with him just for the money? Or worse, what if he's just having fun here before he goes back to his life in New York?" Grace was silent for a moment, her wise eyes studying her granddaughter's face. "Emma, dear, love doesn't care about social class or what other people think. The question is, what do you feel when you're with him?" Emma closed her eyes, letting the memories of the moments with James flood her mind. The way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the long conversations about art, dreams and the future, the way he made her laugh even on the most stressful days. "I feel alive," Emma whispered, opening her eyes. "Like anything is possible." Grace smiled, covering her granddaughter's hand with her own. "So maybe instead of worrying about what other people think, you should focus on that feeling." Emma nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thanks, Grandma." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, James was walking down Main Street, his hands in his pockets and his gaze lost. He stopped in front of a store window, his reflection in the glass making him frown. Who was that man staring back at him? It was no longer the executive in the impeccable suit, but neither was it the carefree boy who had left Millbrook all those years ago. He was someone in the middle of the road, looking for a new purpose. His phone vibrated in his pocket, bringing him back to reality. It was a message from his sister in New York. "Jimmy, when are you coming back? The company needs you. This midlife crisis of yours has gone on long enough." James felt a knot forming in his stomach. The pressure to return to his old life was growing by the day, but the thought of leaving Millbrook, of leaving Emma. He put his phone away without answering and continued his walk, his steps taking him unconsciously towards the library. As he turned the corner, he saw Emma coming out of the building, carrying a pile of books and papers. Her face lit up at the sight of him, and James felt his heart race. "James, what a nice surprise to see you here." He smiled, picking up some books to help her. "I thought I'd stop by, see if you needed any help with anything." Emma laughed. "My hero. Actually, I'm heading to the community center. We have a meeting about funding the project." They started walking together, falling into an easy conversation about the plans for the arts center. James loved the passion with which Emma talked about the project, the way her eyes sparkled as she described her ideas. However, as they approached the community center, James noticed a few curious glances and whispers from passing residents. Emma also seemed to notice, her smile faltering slightly. "Emma," James began hesitantly, do you mind what people might be thinking? About us, I mean." Emma stopped walking, turning to face him. There was a mixture of vulnerability and determination in her eyes. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember how much you've done for the community, how much you genuinely care, and that's what really matters." James felt a warmth spread through his chest. He wanted to pull her close, to kiss her right there in the middle of the street. But before he could do anything, a familiar voice interrupted them. "James Morrison, so the rumors were true." They turned to see Frank Thompson approaching, his gaze alternating between James and Emma with a barely disguised expression of disapproval. "Frank," James greeted, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "How are you?" "Better than you, apparently," Frank replied with a forced smile. "Dropping everything in New York to play philanthropist in Millbrook? Your family must be proud." Emma stepped forward, her eyes sparkling. "Mr. Thompson, James has been a valuable addition to our community. His support for the Arts Center project—" "Ah, yes, the famous project," Frank interrupted her, his tone condescending. "I hope you know what you're doing, Morrison. It would be a shame to see your family's money being misused." James felt his jaw clench, an anger he hadn't felt for a long time bubbling up in his chest. But before he could respond, Emma placed a hand on his arm, her touch calming him instantly. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thompson," Emma said, her voice firm but polite. "But I can assure you that every penny invested in the project will be used responsibly and transparently. In fact, you are invited to our next accountability meeting." Frank seemed surprised by Emma's calm response. He muttered something unintelligible and walked away, casting one last suspicious glance at the couple. When he was out of sight, James turned to Emma, admiration clear in his eyes. "You were amazing." Emma shrugged, but there was a slight blush on her cheeks. "I just told the truth." They resumed their walk in silence, both lost in thought. The doubts and obstacles were there, clear as day. The age difference, the different worlds they came from, the expectations and judgments of the community. But as they walked side by side, their arms occasionally touching, both Emma and James felt a certainty growing in their hearts. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The aroma of freshly baked apple pie filled Grace's small house, mingling with the comforting smell of fresh coffee. The golden light of late afternoon poured through the kitchen windows, creating a cozy, nostalgic atmosphere. Emma was sitting at the table watching her grandmother with a mixture of admiration and concern. Grace moved around the kitchen with the grace of someone who knew every inch of the space, but Emma couldn't help noticing the slight tremor in her hands as she cut the pie. "Grandma," Emma began hesitantly, "are you sure you don't want me to do this?" Grace laughed, a soft, melodious sound that immediately calmed Emma. "Honey, I may be old, but I can still cut a pie. Besides," she added with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "I have to keep my skills sharp to impress your new friend." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "James isn't... we're not..." "Oh, please," Grace interrupted with a knowing smile. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. I see how your eyes sparkle when you talk about him." Emma lowered her gaze to her coffee cup, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's complicated, Grandma." Grace sat down at the table, placing a plate with a generous slice of pie in front of her granddaughter. "Love always is, dear, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." Emma looked up, meeting her grandmother's wise and gentle gaze. "But what if I'm making a mistake? What if the townspeople are right? Maybe it's too much to expect someone like James to want to stay in a place like Millbrook." Grace reached out, covering Emma's hand with her own. Her fingers, although wrinkled by time, still conveyed strength and comfort. "Emma, my love, do you remember the story of how your grandfather and I met?" Emma nodded, a nostalgic smile forming on her face. It was a story she had heard countless times over the years, but one that never failed to touch her. "Your grandfather was an outsider, just like James," Grace began, her eyes straying into distant memories. "He came to Millbrook to work on building the new bridge. Everyone said he would leave as soon as the work was finished, that I was wasting my time." Emma listened intently, even though she knew every detail of the story. "But do you know what your grandfather said to me when people started talking?" Grace continued, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "He said, 'Grace, dear, if I wanted to hear what everyone thinks, I would have become a broadcaster, not a bridge builder.'" Emma laughed, imagining her grandfather, a man she had only known through Grace's stories, but who had always seemed so alive and real in her imagination. "The point is, Emma, Grace said, her voice becoming more serious. Love doesn't care what people think. It doesn't care where you come from or where you're going. Love cares about the here and now, about how you feel when you're with that person. Emma felt tears forming in her eyes, moved by her grandmother's wisdom and unconditional love. But what if it doesn't work out? What if he leaves? Grace gently squeezed Emma's hand. Then you will have lived, loved and learned. There's no shame in that, dear. The shame is in never trying for fear of what might happen. At that moment, the sound of a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Grace smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Speak of the devil. Emma stood up hastily, smoothing her dress and running her hands through her hair in a nervous gesture. Grandma, you didn't... Oh, I did, Grace replied with an innocent smile. I thought it was about time I met this boy who's been stealing so much of my granddaughter's time. Before Emma could protest, Grace was already on her way to the door. Emma followed, her heart beating fast. The door opened to reveal James, looking a little nervous but impeccably dressed in a light blue shirt and dark pants. He held a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. Mrs. Dawson, he greeted with a warm smile. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Emma speaks highly of you. Grace studied him for a moment, her keen eyes assessing the man in front of her. Then, to Emma's relief, she cracked a wide smile. James, darling, come in. And please, call me Grace. Mrs. Dawson makes me feel even older than I already am. James laughed, visibly relaxing as he entered the house. His eyes met Emma's, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear around them. Grace watched the silent exchange between the two, a knowing smile on her lips. Well, she said, breaking the moment, why don't we all go into the kitchen? I've got an apple pie waiting to be tasted. As they followed Grace into the kitchen, James leaned over to Emma, whispering, Your grandmother is exactly as you described. Incredible. Emma smiled, feeling a wave of affection for them both. Wait until you taste her pie. You'll never want to leave. The comment, although made lightly, carried a weight that didn't go unnoticed by James. He took Emma's hand, intertwining their fingers. Who says I want to leave? The rest of the evening passed in a mixture of laughter, stories, and moments of deep connection. Grace enchanted James with her stories about Millbrook and her youth, while James shared experiences from his life in New York and his travels around the world. Emma watched the interaction between the two, her heart filling with a hope she dared not name. Seeing James there, so at ease in his grandmother's simple kitchen, laughing at Grace's old jokes and listening intently to her stories, Emma felt as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. As the evening drew to a close and James prepared to leave, Grace surprised him with a warm hug. Come back any time, darling, she said, and take good care of my Emma. James nodded solemnly. I promise, Grace, and thank you for a wonderful evening. As Emma walked him to the door, Grace watched them from the kitchen, a satisfied smile on her face. She knew, with the wisdom that only the years can bring, that she had witnessed the start of something special. On the balcony, under the starry Millbrook sky, Emma and James said goodbye with a soft kiss, full of unspoken promises. When James finally left, Emma went back inside to find her grandmother still in the kitchen. Well? Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. Emma couldn't contain the smile that spread across her face. You were right, Grandma, as always. Grace laughed, pulling her granddaughter into a hug. Love, my dear, is always a gamble. But with the right heart, it's a gamble worth taking. As they prepared for bed, Emma reflected on the evening, on her grandmother's words and on the future that now seemed so full of possibilities. With Grace as her beacon and James by her side, she felt ready to face any challenge fate might bring. The sun had barely risen when James woke up, a mixture of anxiety and excitement, making his heart beat faster. Today was the day of the big community event he had organized with Emma's help. Sitting on the edge of the bed in the small hotel room he now called his temporary home, he let his thoughts wander back over the last few weeks. The idea for the event had come up almost by accident during one of his many late-night chats with Emma in the library garden. She talked passionately about how art could bring the community together, and James, inspired by her enthusiasm, suggested a festival that would bring together local artists of all ages and styles. What began as a vague idea quickly took on a shape and life of its own. James used his contacts and resources to secure a suitable space, tents, sound and lighting equipment. Emma, for her part, mobilized the local artistic community, from elementary school children to the elderly in the nursing home, all eager to showcase their talents. Now, standing in front of the mirror adjusting his shirt, James hardly recognized the man staring back at him. He was no longer the executive in the impeccable suit, nor the displaced tourist who had arrived in Millbrook weeks ago. It was someone new, someone with purpose. The sound of a horn brought him out of his reverie. Through the window, he saw Emma standing next to her old pickup truck, waving cheerfully. James smiled, grabbed his jacket, and went out to meet her. "Ready for the big day?" Emma asked, her eyes shining with excitement. James nodded, feeling a wave of warmth at the sight of her enthusiasm. "As ready as I can be. Let's go." The venue, a large field on the outskirts of town, was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Volunteers were running around setting up tents, organizing exhibits and testing sound equipment. "James! Emma!" Grace's voice reached them before they could even get out of the car. Emma's grandmother was walking towards them, carrying a huge basket covered in a checkered cloth. "I've brought some sandwiches and lemonade for the volunteers. Where can I leave them?" James smiled, taking the basket from Grace's hands. "You're an angel, Grace. I'll take it to the food tent. Emma, can you check with the artists if they need anything?" Emma nodded, giving her grandmother a quick kiss on the cheek before heading towards the artists' tents. James watched her walk away, amazed by her energy and charisma. "She's special, isn't she?" Grace's soft voice brought him back to reality. James turned to the lady, a sincere smile on his face. "More than I can express, Grace." Grace patted him gently on the arm. "Then don't let her get away, my dear. Now let's feed these people before they faint from hunger." The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. James was running around, solving last-minute problems, from microphones with poor contact to nervous artists in need of words of encouragement. It was during one of these runs that he came across a group of men standing near the main entrance. In the center was Frank Thompson, his arms crossed and a skeptical expression on his face. Well, if it isn't the great James Morrison," Frank said, his tone laden with sarcasm. "Turning into Millbrook's benefactor, are you?" James felt his stomach contract, but kept his composure. "Frank, good to see you. Have you come to enjoy the festival?" Frank stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Actually, I came to see for myself what you're up to. First you show up out of the blue after years, then you start throwing money around like it's water. What's your game, Morrison?" James took a deep breath, feeling the other men's curious gazes on him. For a moment, he found himself back in the meeting room in New York, about to close a big deal. But this wasn't a deal. It was something much more important. "Frank," James began, his voice calm but firm, "there's no game. I'm here because I realize that I've spent years chasing the wrong things. Money, status, power. None of it filled the emptiness I felt. But here, helping this community, working alongside incredible people like Emma and Grace, I've finally found a purpose." Frank seemed surprised by the sincerity in James's voice. Before he could reply, however, they were interrupted by an excited shout. "Mr. Thompson, how nice of you to come." It was Lily, a little 10-year-old girl James recognized from the paint shop. She ran up to Frank holding a colorful painting. "Look what I've painted, it's your hardware store." Frank's hard face softened instantly. He knelt down to Lily's height, examining the painting with a genuine smile. "It's beautiful, darling. You've got real talent." James watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion. This was the true power of art and community. It wasn't the big donations or the elaborate events, but the small moments of human connection. Frank stood up, clearing his throat, clearly moved. He looked at James, a new understanding in his eyes. Maybe I misjudged your intentions, Morrison." James held out his hand. "How about we start again, Frank? This festival is for all of us. Why don't you take a walk, enjoy the art, the music? I'm sure Lily would love to show you more of her work." Frank hesitated for a moment before shaking James's hand. I think I can do that. As Frank walked away with Lily, James felt a presence beside him. It was Emma, her eyes shining with pride. "You were amazing," she said softly. "The way you dealt with Frank. You really care about this community, don't you?" James pulled her close, kissing her softly. "More than I ever thought possible. And it's thanks to you, Emma. You've shown me what really matters in life." The sound of applause made them separate. The main stage had opened and a young violinist was beginning her performance. Soft music filled the air, mingling with the laughter and animated conversations of the participants. James and Emma walked hand in hand through the festival, stopping to admire the works of art, chat to the artists, and simply soak up the atmosphere of joy and togetherness that permeated the place. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James took to the stage for a short closing speech. Looking out at the crowd, he saw smiling faces, eyes bright with emotion, and above all, a palpable sense of community. "Thank you all for making this day truly special," he began, his voice charged with emotion. "When I arrived at Millbrook a few weeks ago, I was lost, searching for something I didn't even know how to define. Today, thanks to each and every one of you, I have found not just a purpose, but a home." His eyes met Emma's in the crowd, and he felt his heart expand with love and gratitude. This festival is just the beginning. Together, we can build a bright future for Millbrook, a future full of art, culture, and above all, togetherness. As the crowd applauded, James came down from the stage and was immediately enveloped in a tight hug by Emma. Over her shoulder, he saw Grace smiling approvingly, Frank nodding respectfully, and dozens of faces full of hope and gratitude. At that moment, under the first stars that were beginning to dot the Millbrook sky, James knew for sure he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The dawn in Millbrook brought with it a fresh breeze laden with the scent of magnolias in bloom. Emma was sitting on the porch of her grandmother's house, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Next to her, on the small, weathered wooden table, rested an envelope. Inside was an offer that could change the course of her life, a scholarship to a prestigious art school in New York, the opportunity she had always dreamed of, now within reach. But what should have been a source of pure joy now left her torn. Emma closed her eyes, letting the memories of the last few months flood her mind. The art festival, the community center that was beginning to take shape, the children whose eyes sparkled as they discovered a new artistic talent, and James, with his gentle smile and eyes that seemed to see into your soul. "Penny, for your thoughts." Grace's soft voice brought her out of her reverie. Emma opened her eyes to see her grandmother settling into the chair next to her, her own coffee in hand. "Grandma," Emma began, her voice trembling, "how do you know when you're making the right choice?" Grace smiled, that wise smile that always seemed to have all the answers. "Oh dear, life rarely presents us with easy choices. The secret is not to try to guess the future, but to listen to your heart in the present." Emma sighed, picking up the envelope. "But what if my heart is divided? This opportunity in New York, it's everything I've ever dreamed of. But leaving Millbrook, leaving the project, leaving..." She hesitated. "Leaving James." Grace reached out, covering Emma's hand with her own. "Emma, my love, remember what I always say. Roots give us strength, but wings allow us to fly. Your roots will always be here in Millbrook no matter where you go." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. "But what if by flying, I lose everything I've built here?" "Oh, darling," Grace said softly. "True love, true passion, they withstand distance and time. If what you and James have is real, if your love for this community is genuine, none of it will be lost just because you seek to grow." At that moment, the sound of footsteps on the balcony steps made them both turn around. James was there, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands and an expression of surprise on his face at the sight of the two women. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," he said hesitantly. Emma stood up quickly, wiping away her tears. "James, we were just talking." Grace stood up too, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "Well, I think it's time I went and made some more coffee. You two look like you need to talk." When Grace entered the house, a heavy silence fell over Emma and James. It was he who finally broke the silence. "Did you get the letter?" he said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded, unable to find the right words. James stepped forward, handing her the flowers. "Emma, I came here to tell you that no matter what you decide, I support you." Emma looked at him in surprise. "Do you know about the offer?" James smiled, a smile full of love and a touch of sadness. "Grace told me yesterday. She thought I should know." Emma felt her heart squeeze. "James, He interrupted her gently, taking her hands in his. "Emma, listen. When I came to Millbrook, I was lost, searching for something I didn't even know how to define. You showed me what it is to have a purpose, what it is to love not just one person, but an entire community." He paused, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. "But I also know that you have dreams, dreams that go beyond Millbrook, and I would be selfish if I asked you to give them up for me or anyone else." Emma felt the tears running freely down her face now. "But what about the arts center? What about everything we've built here?" James smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "The arts center will continue. The community has embraced the project, and I promise to look after it while you're away. And as for us..." He hesitated for a moment. "Well, New York isn't that far away." Emma stared at him, seeing in those blue eyes all the love and support she could wish for. At that moment, she knew what she needed to do. "I'm going," she said softly. "I'm going to New York." James pulled her into a tight hug, and Emma felt as if all the love in the world was contained in that gesture. When they parted, Emma saw that Grace had returned to the balcony, watching the scene with watery eyes. "Grandma," Emma began, her voice breaking. Grace interrupted her with a hug. "Go, my dear. Go and conquer the world. We'll be here, cheering you on and waiting for your visits." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. The news of Emma's departure spread quickly through the city, and to her surprise, instead of resentment, she was met with support and encouragement. The night before her departure, the community organized a farewell party at the Arts Center, which was still under construction. The unfinished walls were covered with paintings and drawings made by Emma's students, each piece a reminder of the impact she had made. As Emma made her way around the party, saying thank you and goodbye, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Every familiar face, every tight hug, was a reminder of how much Millbrook meant to her. Finally, she found herself alone with James in a quiet corner of the hall. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Emma took a deep breath, looking around one last time. "I think so. But promise you'll keep me updated on everything that happens here." James smiled, taking her hands. "I promise. And I also promise that I'll be here, waiting for you no matter how long it takes." Emma felt her heart expand with love. "It won't be forever," she said. "This is my house, my home. New York is just a stop on the way." James pulled her close, sealing the promise with a soft kiss. The next morning, as the sun rose over Millbrook, Emma embarked on her new journey. Looking out of the car window as she left town, she saw James and Grace waving from the balcony. Her heart was full of love, of hope, of possibilities. Emma knew that no matter where life took her, a part of her would always belong to Millbrook, to the community that shaped her, to the man who loved her, and to the dreams they shared. And one day she would return, bringing with her new colors to paint the future of her hometown. As Millbrook disappeared over the horizon, Emma smiled. It wasn't goodbye. It was just the start of a new chapter, a chapter full of promise, growth, and above all, love. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.